This is College Football with Sam, today giving you my deep dive and analysis of the Vrbo Fiesta Bowl, which is a matchup between the 6th seed Penn State Nittany Lions, who stand at 12-2, 8-1 in Big Ten Conference play. They were one of the 4 winners of the first round of the first ever 12-team college football playoff, where Penn State beat SMU. Boise State is one of the 4 highest-ranked conference champions that consequentially gets a bye. They were excused from the first week of the college football playoff and got some extra time to rest and prepare for whatever the connecting first-round game was going to be. So for Boise State, that game was Penn State versus SMU. They got some extra time to prepare for one of, or maybe both if they thought the game was going to be competitive, the SMU Mustangs and the Penn State Nittany Lions, an extra week of practice to get everyone healthy. The Boise State Broncos are on the other side of the Fiesta Bowl. They are the 3 seed with a 12-1 record, 7-0 in Mountain West Conference play. They are the Mountain West champions. The Penn State Nittany Lions were the Big Ten runner-ups, losing to Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. Boise State beat UNLV in the Mountain West Conference championship game and also beat them in the regular season as well. This is a very exciting matchup because we get to see Ashton Jeanty, the Heisman runner-up, one of the best players, if not the best player in the country. And in my opinion, respectfully, he is the best player in the country. And that's no knock on Travis Hunter or Cam Ward or Dylan Gabriel or Tyler Warren or these other players who got Heisman votes or were in the conversation or should have been in the conversation. But Jeanty's phenomenal. And we get to see him against a Penn State team who is probably the best team that Boise State has played all season long. Remember, when they played Oregon in their second game of the season, Oregon still had some injuries along the offensive line. They were a bit banged up overall, a bit disheveled. They didn't look that good against Idaho. And someone mentioned in my comment section that maybe Oregon was right. They were already righting the ship, per se, in week 2, and maybe Boise State is that good. So we have a lot to learn, is basically what I'm trying to say here in this Fiesta Bowl. I think we get to see Boise State face their biggest test of the season, and for Penn State, Boise State is not a team to underestimate, or not a team to be funny with or to mess around with whatsoever, because they don't just have Ashton Jeanty, but they have a lot of other good players that we'll be talking about here. Penn State enters this game as fairly heavy favorites, little over a touchdown here. The spread, to be exact, is Penn State minus 11. That's where the line opened up, and FPI gives them a 65.4% chance to win this game. But let's get into this deep dive here. It's worth a long intro for an important game like this, but before we get into this deep dive and I give you my analysis and we talk about all these things, matchups, players, coaching advantages, what I saw on film, what my model thinks toward the end of the video, I want you, if possible, to subscribe to the channel. It's just very simple. Just hit the big red subscribe button. You can do it by clicking the little subscribe button, not just beside my channel, but also you can click the YouTube button logo with subscribe that's right on your screen. Just click that and you can subscribe. And also hit the notification bell, like the video, share this video around to other college football fans who love the sport and enjoy it. Comment your thoughts down below. Tell me how Christmas was and if you have any New Year's Day plans, and also give any analysis that you have on this game. And I would also say to join the Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. If you want to donate money to support the work that I do here, make sure to check out the Patreon page and sign up as a paid member, or purchase merchandise via my merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And remember, guys, comment down below and your ticket to my giveaway, where we have 4 winners, your ticket is punched. And the winners will be announced January 9th and 10th during the semifinal games. There are 4 of them. There will be a $20 gift card, just a straight-up Visa gift card that you can spend on anything, so basically $20. And then there will be an additional $20 where you can spend exclusively on my merchandise store. So you'll want to enter that giveaway. Make sure to comment below for that, and also share this video and other videos during this week around so that others can enter. And last thing If you want to check out my Oregon versus Ohio State deep dive, which I encourage you do so, the link to that will be in the pinned comment, and it will be the same with my Penn State versus Boise State preview and prediction video, which is shorter, more condensed. You'll get some of my initial thoughts on this, and also it's just, good analysis and perspective. We do that for every video. This is just the extended cut with less of a filter and even more of my thoughts, because I've learned some things since my original prediction. And speaking of my original prediction, I'm going to give it here very quickly, and then we'll get into some things that I've learned, what the power ratings say. You know the whole deal. So my original prediction was Penn State winning this game 38-17. The thought process was that Boise State will start the game fast because they're coming off of a long period of rest. And some people have mentioned this as a disadvantage. I don't think it is. There's less fatigue. And if you're a good coaching staff, a long period of rest like this is going to play to your advantage. It just is. There will be more positives than there will be negatives. Why do we think the NFL gives buys to the number 1 seed? If they weren't insanely advantageous, they wouldn't be giving them. They just wouldn't. So because of that buy, because I think Spencer Danielson is a good coach and has a good staff, and Boise State had some injuries that they dealt with, and I thought that Jeanty was a little bit worn out toward the end of the year. All these things for Boise State that were maybe negatives are going to be less so in this game. They're going to be reduced negatives. And I also think that there will be really good scripted drives, especially on the offensive side of the ball. So Boise State will start this game fast. I thought that Jeanty would have 100-plus rushing yards, about 1 to 2 rushing touchdowns, by the way. I still think he'll get around there based off of things that I watched that we'll talk about throughout this video. But he's an amazing player. I think he'll have some success against this Penn State defense. It just depends on the other factors for Boise. Their passing attack, their pass rush, their pass defense straight up in coverage, tackling, their run stoppage, their ability to get penetration on opposing offensive lines. And at the end of the day, even with a player as amazing as Jeanty, I thought that Penn State would just figure it out. They would figure out Boise State, eventually contain them, slow down Jeanty, and eventually pull away. And also that Penn State's depth and adjustments on top of that are what was going to win this football game, win the Fiesta Bowl. But that was my original prediction. So now I want to get into what the power ratings are saying here, just kind of a consensus, or in this case, unanimous feel surrounding this game. So Football Power Index, and I adjusted some of these rankings or ratings or predictive models here. I didn't for college football insiders and college football nerds, because they use predictive models that aren't just using point spreads. They straight up factor in different things like success rate, for example, or echo rate, which College Football Insider's head Parker Fleming came up with, or if you want to talk about adjusted success, net success, college football nerds, what they do is they cross-reference a ton for their statistics, so it's called relative performance. So I didn't touch those, but for FPI, S&P Plus, and Kelly Ford, which I think are more power ratings for comparing which team would be favored over another neutral field, just that, not much else, I did add some points to Boise State because they're on a bye. More importantly, though, I think is the fact that they're in the same time zone as the Fiesta Bowl, and it's not the same distance traveled to the Fiesta Bowl that Penn State has, going all the way from Pennsylvania to Arizona, whereas Boise State just has to go from Idaho to Arizona. Yeah, change in climate, change in weather, obviously traveling a few states down, but closer in proximity, more similar environment nonetheless than what Penn State will be playing in. But anyway, just wanted to put that out there, and regardless of that, Football Power Index is Penn State being favored in / winning this game by 7.7 points. For S&P Plus, that's 9.5 points for Penn State. Kelly Ford has it by 8.9 for Penn State. College Football Insiders is Penn State winning this game by 10.3 points. College Football Nerds is Penn State winning by 7.5 points. My potential power index is Penn State winning this game by about 17.1 points to be exact. So it's a unanimous feel that Penn State is going to win this game by a touchdown at the minimum if not more, and in some cases even by 2 scores, like S&P Plus, College Football Insiders, My Potential Power Index. There's a lot going on here for both of these teams, a lot of intricate parts, a lot of moving parts. Of course, you have 85 scholarship players on each roster and even more walk-ons that will sadly be eliminated next year. Next year it'll just be 105 scholarship players on all rosters. So there's a lot of different factors here. But overall, all those different factors add up to, on both teams, a superior quality and team in Penn State per the power ratings, and a good team in Boise State who's teetering inside the top 25 almost unanimously on most power ratings. But Penn State, meanwhile, is top 10, maybe even in some cases top 5. So the power ratings very much favor Penn State here. Now I want to look at dominance and see how effective and how impressive each team was against their average opponent, against their strength of schedule, and just really look at the dominance and the ability of these teams to establish game control here, which is something that I will admit neither of these two teams are all that impressive at doing. I mean, you look at the game control rank there. For Penn State, it's 14th. For Boise State, 16th. For Boise State, that's impressive for a Group of 5 school. It's not near elite or elite nationally, but for a G5 school, that's a very good job there by Spencer Danielson, their head coach. For Penn State, I would say given the caliber of roster they have and some of the coaches they have, assistant-wise, coordinator-wise, even James Franklin, who I've given him a lot of criticism. I think he deserves a lot of criticism for how he manages games and how he performs against the top 10, top 5 teams. But alas, he typically does a pretty good job of destroying the mediocre, of destroying the bad, and handily beating even good teams, as long as they are not, top 10, top 5. That's not been the case with Penn State this year. And it's very weird because player personnel-wise, this feels like one of Penn State's best rosters ever under Franklin. From a mentality-wise for Penn State's players, I think these players are more clutch. See USC on the road, see Oregon where Drew Allar was making really good high-level NFL throws. His receivers were catching balls in clutch moments like 3rd and long or the 4th and long play. That resulted in a touchdown, kept Penn State in the game, even with a chance to win it after they forced an Oregon punt. And yet, despite those two things, they played very competitively with a USC team that, to be fair, played Notre Dame down to the wire until Maeva threw 2 very dumb interceptions for pick sixes, to say the least. And yeah, I mean, to be fair, again, they played everyone down to the wire, but that was even the bad teams. And USC overall was kind of like 2021 Nebraska, a team in which just beat them, just win. That can be a one-off for Penn State, but they also played Bowling Green fairly competitively. I understand, again, that Harold Fannin Jr. is kind of an alien, but regardless, not a great look. Minnesota, they only beat by 1, needed a fake punt to kind of pull that whole thing off. And there are other games as well, like Illinois, 21-7. They were very dominant that game, Penn State was, but by the scoreboard, which is very important, they couldn't pull away until late in the 4th quarter here. So neither of these teams are as good as many of the teams in the playoff field at game control, per the game control rank. I think Penn State's probably a little bit underrated, at least in terms of their potential to game control teams. I think their trench play is elite, and we'll talk about that very soon. Boise State, by the way, has very underrated trench play. It's been noticed by many people, by myself, that Boise's O-line is good. Their defensive line, especially defensive front, can be effective, especially in pass rush. We'll talk about that later, but I wanted to spend a few extra minutes talking about these teams because they're not exactly dominant. I think what makes these teams special are their non-negotiables, their alien players. Tyler Warren and Abdul Carter for Penn State and Ashton Jeanty for Boise State. The talent on these rosters and also some of the coaches as well. You look at points per play margin, Boise State's 0.210 points per play margin, Very impressive for a G5 team that's top 10 nationally. Penn State's also inside the top 10 with a 0.259 points per play margin. In expected points added margin, Boise State's just 0.085. Penn State has a 0.204. I think a lot of that boils down to the fact that Ashton Jeanty has gotten a lot of explosive runs, like a ton of them, from field position that, statistics and analytics would say are not exactly favorable for scoring touchdowns in that moment right there. And also, Boise State's defense is very effective at bend but don't break, where opponents will move the ball, and you will move the ball if you have a competent offense on Boise State. We'll talk about that later. But they do a very good job of not letting their opponents score. And I think what Boise State is pretty good at, and this is why they win, is they sort of snowball their opponents. And they get ahead of them. They can counterpunch you because Ashton Jeanty is a cheat code, and you don't have that. And they're well coached. They have an underrated QB. They don't turn over the football. And you make mistakes, they don't, and they have a unicorn. That's a very hard combination to beat right there. So I think, consequentially, they overperform expectations game per game. Other times, not so much. But again, that factors back into the whole game control thing. In terms of yards per point margin, how many yards do you need to get to score a single point compared to how many yards your opponents need to get to score a single point? Penn State is a 4.6 points per play margin. Boise is a 4.2. Penn State's average scoring margin per game is 18 points, so 3 possessions. For Boise State's a little bit lower at 15.1 points, plus 15.1 points, which is just a little bit around or over a typical 2-score game, not the usual 14 as that would be referenced, but 15. Penn State's yards per play margin is rather impressive. They average 2.2 additional yards per play compared to what their opponent averages per play. For Boise, that's only a 1.2, and that's including all the explosive runs that Jeanty has, and I think that right there circles right back to the expected points added margin, where field position-wise and how you move the ball compared to how your opponents move the ball in the sum total of things, Boise State is not that dominant, but they do a much better job of scoring points and getting touchdowns than their opponents do, and that's a real difference there. Penn State's 50% offensive success rate, pulled this from at StatsOWar on Twitter, Parker Fleming, and College Football Insiders. 50% is second nationally. I mean, Kotelnicki does a very good job at winning the play-per-play battle. Boise State defensively, 37.7% success rate on defense, not top 10, but just around the top 25 mark. It's similar with Penn State's 37.1% defensive success rate. It was much higher early in the year, but that Oregon game where Oregon almost won the play-per-play battle every time they faced Penn State's defense, with a few exceptions, really brought that down. Boise State, 46.8% offensive success rate. Game control for Boise, 16th. Their average in-game win probability is 8th. And for Penn State, they're 14th in both those categories. Game control and average in-game win probability rank. So we've talked about that a lot. Perhaps a bit too much, but I think it's important to take note of the fact that Boise State's an overachieving team. Penn State can be overachieving. Like against Oregon, I'm telling you, you put their effort and their style of play and their ceiling on offense against Oregon combined with what they showed against Ohio State defensively, that team would almost beat everyone else, including a lot of college football playoff teams who remain their ceiling, too. People have known for a while that I'm very high on Penn State, but I also want to acknowledge that their floor can be a bit low for what they have on both offense and defense. And I think it's a variety of factors, some limitations they have, but we'll talk about that here. Before I want to get to the different position groups on the field, I want to talk about some off-the-field things or on the sideline things like coaching, and also discuss just general schematic or roster edges that these teams may have over each other. And I think Penn State has almost all of them, if I'm being really honest about it. I think that James Franklin is a good head coach, maybe great. I think that anyone should stay away from saying near elite or elite in the same sentence as James Franklin, unless there is a not included with the near elite or elite statement. But he's still good, still great. Spencer Danielson is only in his first year at Boise State as the full-time head coach. And by the way, I do think he's good, but Franklin has done a pretty good job of just consistently winning against the small teams, the mediocre teams, the good teams, even sometimes beats teams of similar caliber talent. The teams he doesn't beat typically have more talent than he does. For Boise State, Spencer Danielson, really good job winning the Mountain West this year. This is the best Group of 5 team in the country. What I will say, though, is that he's only in year one as being a full-time head coach, and with that, it's hard to put him higher than Franklin, who is a proven coach over decades, who has very proven weaknesses, but also very proven strengths. I think that Penn State has the superior offensive staff and the defensive staff as well. I think that their coordinators, their assistant coaches are better. I got some flack from Boise State fans for saying that Penn State has an edge on the offensive staff, and I don't know what to say to that. Go watch Kotelnicki's offense at Kansas, or watch Penn State's offense last year, and watch Penn State's offense this year. Scoring offense-wise, Penn State was actually better last year than this year, which is something I still think is particularly funny. But that's because Penn State's defense was uber aggressive last year, got a ton of turnovers. Their special teams were much better, so they got more field goals, could kick more field goals. They even returned some punts for touchdowns, and their offense constantly got set up with short fields by the defense. Just looking at Penn State's offense this year against Ohio State in juxtaposition to their offense last year against Ohio State, the game planning is better, the execution is better. The roster limitations are pretty much still there, but I also thought that Penn State's offensive game plan against Ohio State was just straight up bad. I don't think they played their A game in that game. Looking at how the receivers were on multiple plays running into each other, definitely a lot of confusion, a lot of nervousness and emotion in that game. But I think that Penn State has the superior staff. I think they're better at run blocking. I think that Jeanty makes the O-line look better than it is in run blocking for Boise State. Now, Boise State is a good run blocking O-line unit, and they're good in pass blocking as well. But Penn State does not have the running back that Boise State has. And Jeanty does a whole lot of work for the offense and really carries it on his back. Well, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen, very important elements. Outside of Tyler Warren, maybe the most important elements of the offense. Singleton might be the most important element of the offense outside of the O-line when he's healthy, even more so than Warren. Really good receiver back and fast in space, has just built himself to be a much better player this year than his freshman year or sophomore year, but he's still not Ashton Jeanty, and he's a feature or part of the offense. Jeanty is closer to the whole offense than not. So I give Penn State the edge in blocking, run block, pass block. An overall run offense, you have Jeanty if you're Boise State, and I considered giving Boise State this, and maybe this is misplaced by me, but Penn State has ran for a 200 yards, even close to 300 yards in several games. And you have to factor in the offensive line there. The offensive line is mostly what produces a rushing attack. It just is, with some rare exceptions. I think Jeanty being one of them. But I have to give, and maybe this is a little bit of doubt, and I'm willing to take that, I have to give Penn State run offense here as kind of a tiebreaker with their O-line being much better, them being more talented. And I love Jeanty. I think he's the best player in the country. But I've also seen what stacked boxes sometimes do to him because his offensive line is just not elite. I mean, he is their ground attack. Penn State's ground attack is more balanced. It's the best in the Big Ten. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. It's the best in the Big Ten right now, and not many other rushing attacks are particularly close to Penn State's at this moment in the Big Ten. And I'd say, outside of Notre Dame's, it's the best in the Power Four. Maybe I'm forgetting someone, but I don't think I am. You look at pass offense, easily Penn State, and defensively, I think anyone, whether you're a Boise State fan, Penn State fan, or any type of college football fan, you'd agree with me that Penn State's better everywhere on defense. Run defense, pass defense, and even outside and inside edge, which a lot of that has to do with pressure, has to do with tackling. Are you better at getting inside leverage or outside leverage? Boise State analytically has the better pass rush volume-wise, but Penn State's played better opponents. They have the better pass rusher in Abdul Carter. They have the deeper defensive line, and they're better at tackling. They are. What I've seen from Boise State this year is very boom or bust on defense. Penn State has some of their own tackling issues, but their floor is much higher on defense. Same with their ceiling. In terms of X-Factor players and reliable depth, that goes to Penn State as well. They don't have a player like Ashton Jeanty, by the way. Jeanty's very unique. He's better, in my mind, than Tyler Warren and than Abdul Carter, like as a player. But there's only one of him. There's two aliens for Penn State. I think Warren and Carter, and there are many more players who I'd say are great near elite or elite players, like X-Factor players for Penn State. Outside of Jeanty, I can't really think of another player who fits that bill. Ahmed Hassanian is one who could be up there, but I just think he's great or good. I don't know about near elite exactly. And that goes for some players on Boise State's offensive line. And speaking of the wide receiver room, which I think is where we should start our position-by-position comparison, because I think that's the biggest area of separation on this team, is either wide receiver or running back. Running back because Jeanty's insane, not because Penn State's running backs are bad. They have one of the best duos in the country right now. Depending on what they do in the playoff and depending on what Ohio State does in the Rose Bowl, they might have the better running back duo. I'd still go with Ohio State's right now, but Penn State's is that good to where you can compare Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen to Quinshon Judkins and Henderson, and it's not unanimous that Henderson and Judkins are better. I'd lean there, but it's not unanimous like I thought it was in the preseason. It's not. But some of that has to do with other things, much of it, like the offensive line for both teams, than individually who are the more talented backs. But I think even that's up for debate. Anyway here. What I was trying to say is that at wide receiver, I do think Boise State has a decisive edge there comparing the two position groups. We already talked about some matchups here, but we'll get into some more matchups as well when we look at the depth charts for both of these teams. I like Boise State's Prince Straction, Cameron Camper, Latrell Caples, Chris Marshall, Austin Bolt, Chase Perry, and Ben Ford over Penn State's Harrison Walls II, Amari Evans, Julian Fleming, Liam Clifford, Tyler Johnson. I prefer Boise State's wide receiver room. Harrison Walls III, really impressive player. Cam Camper has 837 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, former Indiana wide receiver. He's been the go-to receiver for Vrbo Madsen in this Boise State passing offense, which is very underrated. At running back, I got to go with Jeanty as the better individual running back here, easily over Singleton and Allen. For quarterback, I choose Drew Allar straight up over Vrbo Madsen. At tight end, easy. It's Tyler Warren, Khalil Dinkins, also Luke Reynolds. Very deep tight end room that Penn State has there. For Boise State, Matt Lauder and Matt Wagner are a good pair of tight ends, but again, Tyler Warren's an alien, and he has really good depth behind him, really good development. So I'm going to side with Penn State at tight end. On the offensive line, Boise State graded out with having better tackles, slightly, and Penn State graded out with having a slightly worse center. Penn State's guards graded out as some of the best in the country and way better than what Boise State has. So that means the interior of the Penn State offensive line, I'm talking about Nick Dawkins. I'm telling you about Sal Wormley, Cooper Cousins, Olivega Ione, Dominic Rulli. I would choose them over Ben Dooley, Tyler Kinath, Zach Holmes, Jason Steele, Nathan Cardona, Carson Rasmussen. I would choose Penn State's interior offensive line. Drew Shelton and Nolan Rucci are the starting tackles for Penn State. And while I think they're good, I think that Cage Casey and Hall Schmidt are a even better pair of offensive tackles. Maybe I'll be proven wrong of course, as these things evolve, as these two teams play each other. One difficult thing for games like this is just the difference in competition is beyond stark. Beyond stark. One of the reasons I believe in Boise State, by the way, is they nearly beat Oregon in Outson. I think the Oregon team of then is worse than the Oregon team of now, but still to play within the margins of that Oregon team within a touchdown to cover the spread, nearly pull off the upset, that was an amazing job by Boise State and their staff and their players in that game. It's one of the reasons I personally believe in them, like as a team who deserved to make the college football playoff. But that is just one game. It's not a large sample size. There were a lot of factors that went into that game, both for Boise State playing as close to Oregon as they did, but also, of course, Oregon coming back and winning. I don't know how that game would go if there was a rematch. I don't. I think that Boise State would compete. I think they have some matchup edges over Oregon, but I don't necessarily know because everyone else they've played all season long has been far inferior to the Ducks, and this is their second game against any team who's remotely close to the top 10, who's a lot better than the top 50, which is where UNLV resides. So that's kind of my thought process here for a lot of these for a lot of these comparisons is I often lean with Penn State in many of these things unless there's a clear advantage or the grades for the position groups are moderately higher, because analytics and grades sometimes don't adjust enough for competition or for depth or development or talent, like these things that you're more apt to see with, let's say, the eye test, for example. That's why for every defensive position I have Penn State, even though Boise State has more sacks and a higher sack percentage. Boise State is special teams, though. That's pretty easy. As for Penn State, Riley Thompson at punter has struggled this year. They haven't really returned kicks. If I'm being honest, they haven't. And then Ryan Barker, their kicker now, after Sander Sahedek got benched, Barker's been good overall, but not perfect. He's not an elite punter. Kicker, rather. You look at Boise State and punter James Ferguson Reynolds, Jonah Dalmas. They've been better. Boise State special teams have been a superior unit in terms of efficiency this season. But on defense overall, I would rather have Deniden Sutton, Zane Durant, Smith Vilbert, Devon J. Thomas, Amin Vanover, Abdul Carter, Tony Roas, Kobe King, Dominic DeLuca, Jalen Kimber, Jalen Reed, Zakee Wheatley, A.J. Harris, Zion Tracy, Elliott Washington, and Davion Collins, to name some backups. I'd rather have them over Ahmed Hassanian, Herbert Gums, Braxton Felly, Jaden Virgin Morgan, Marco Notarani, Andrew Simpson, Amarion McCoy, Alexander Tubner, player who was hurt for much of November, but it sounds like he'll be back for this game, which is huge. They're starting strong safety, 1 point led the team in total tackles, captain, very impactful player. It's good for Boise State to have him back. That makes me very happy. Ty Benefield, Jeremiah Irby, Sei Oladipo, Zion Washington, Rodney Robinson. I'd rather have Penn State's defense and all of their defensive starters over all of Boise State's defensive starters. I mean, it'd be very beneficial for Penn State, let's say, if they had Ahmed Hassanian in their rotation at D end, but Abdul Carter would clearly start over him. I think Deniden Sutton would be of similar caliber to him. There's just a difference in talent and level of play that's very noticeable on these two defenses, respectfully. Moving on now, let's talk about some of these roster matchups here. These grades are from Pro Football Focus, and I will say right here, Boise State is just straight up probably a little bit overvalued. PFF typically overvalues in terms of overall team grades smaller schools, like Army, for example. Army would grade out, I think it's like a top 15 or top 10 team if you only used PFF individual player ratings. They would, because Pro Football Focus doesn't really take into account a lot of strength of schedule stuff. Like they don't. That's kind of more FPI's thing, or S&P Plus, or these different things. They don't factor in raw 4-star and 5-star talent either. They don't. And that's very fair because those things don't definitively determine how good an individual player is. But what they will do is at some level they kind of, with very rare exception, I think Washington of last year, some of the Chris Peterson Boise State teams were an exception to this. Most of the time, those things like talent or what was I taught, like talent or coaching staffs or past success of a team or strength of schedule, they, again, don't determine individual players. In fact, I'd say in many instances, rarely they do, outside of like high school recruiting rankings, which do correlate with future pro success. Not perfectly, but there is a relationship there, a positive one. The higher you are ranked, the higher your likelihood is to get drafted. Again, it's not an exact science, but it gets closer to an exact science the larger your sample sizes. When you go out from just one player to a position group of multiple players to a one side of the ball, including the one to make it 11 here. One side of the ball, defense or offense, your starters, include your 2 deep, do it by 22, do a whole team. And then there's just this multiplying effect on how much talent and coaching and all these different intangibles matter. And so I'm just saying that to say, when you look at the Pro Football Focus grades, and I did this and it almost broke my brain, so I just stopped myself, Boise State actually has a higher average grade per player than Penn State does. So take that with a grain of salt. And by now you'll probably already see where I'm going with this, but I don't want to play pretend. So let's just look at this, how it is, factor in what we need to factor in and out what we need to do out with. But there are some takeaways here. And I think the biggest takeaway is look at number 96 for Boise State. Look at Ashton Jeanty. Now, for most of these positions, I have the 2 deeps graded out. Not just the starters, but the 2 deep, because you never know when injuries are going to happen, and depth matters in these games, in these big games. Ashton Jeanty is way, down, just a little bit. He's a 96. His group is a 96 overall because he's just that good. He's ridiculous. He's the best running back in a single season that we have seen in a long, long time. And I can't help but think, there's the 48 right tackle there for Boise State in terms of grades, but the 83 left tackle, 70 center, 74 left guard, 64 right guard. I can't help but think, looking at that O-line with him against Penn State's middle defense, that's basically the entirety of the defense outside of the corners, and sometimes they'll make tackles, but your safeties, linebackers, D-line are more likely to make tackles than your corners, and if they aren't, then you have some issues. Strong safety for Penn State, 69, 70 free safety, 69 grade at the Lion position, which is Penn State's nickelback. Middle linebacker, 82, weak side linebacker, 65. D-end, 63 for Denai Dennis Sutton, 83 for Abdul Carter, and his backup, again, this is 2 deep. Carter graded out as over a 90 at D-end, which is pretty incredible. And you got Devon J. Thomas and Zane Durant at defensive tackle. I think that Boise State will be able to run here. I do not think that Penn State is going to completely shut them down. Now, to be fair, I wouldn't really say that about any rushing attack. I wouldn't say that about any rushing defense. Not rushing attack, but rushing defense. With maybe one exception. Or maybe actually 2. And I would say those probably would be Indiana and Ohio State. And I think that's because they're the linebackers and safeties and the D-line, they're all fundamentally sound. They all tackle at an elite level. Indiana's really fast and aggressive. Ohio State can be aggressive. Sometimes they're not, but they also have a lot of size there on, again, safeties, linebackers, defensive linemen. Penn State does too. They have a lot of those things. Their D-line, I think, is better than Indiana's and Ohio State's. but they don't have the linebackers or the safeties, particularly in tackling. This is something that I've noticed with Penn State for a few games now. Their D-line get penetration like no other D-line. Like, they're up there with Michigan in terms of defensive line play. I think Michigan's a little bit better, especially in terms of pro talent, but Penn State's close. I think they're the second best D-line in the country. Their problem is their linebackers and safeties. This is more so Tony Roas at weak side linebacker, and their safeties and corners. They don't tackle well. They don't. They don't tackle well for a blue blood team with all the talent on defense that you can imagine, like what Penn State has. And Jeanty rules in yards after contact. He breaks tackles from tacklers that don't typically miss them. So imagine what he could do to a defense that at the second and third level sometimes struggles to tackle running backs or receivers or tight ends. I think that Penn State on defense really needs to emphasize just tackling, making the play. Sometimes I feel like that whole team's identity on that side of the ball, and I think this stems a lot from Manny Diaz, their old DC, is just aggression, force turnovers, get sacks, make big plays. Well, one of the weaknesses of Manny Diaz defenses when he was at Penn State was they did that, and they were very impressive analytically, but it was at the cost of tackling. They were never elite at tackling. It's the same thing with Penn State this year. D-line is awesome, but Boise State has a good offensive line, and I think that Jeanty will be able to block for himself with how good he is. The O-line will open up some holes for him. I mean, against Oregon, they battled with Oregon's D-line. Oregon's D-line, at the end of the day, made some plays, got some inside leverage, but Boise State did a good job of getting outside leverage. They held their own. They carried their water, and that's impressive to do against Derek Harmon, Jamari Caldwell, Jordan Birch, Mateo Uyunglele. It's impressive. It just is. So I think that Boise will be able to get some yards on the ground here. What I am concerned about, though, for Boise is one-dimensionality, because Penn State have been able to be gotten through the air. Oregon did this. Ohio State had moments where they did, but Howard was a bit off kilter in that game. Little bit too much pressure, does not have even close to the O-line that Oregon does, so he couldn't destroy them through the air. But there were opportunities. There were several deep balls that he could have connected on that he just missed, and that would have made the game closer to a dominant Ohio State win than the 7-point win that it actually was. They can be gotten. Penn State secondary can. But the only examples that I just used for that were Ohio State and Oregon, the two best wide receiver groups in the entire country. Boise State doesn't have that. They have some nice receivers. They have some solid tight ends, but nothing close to what Oregon does, nothing close to what Ohio State does, or Ole Miss, or Texas, or these other teams. I mean, Penn State's comparable in the receiver room to Boise State as a whole. They're worse at wide receiver, but they are infinitely better at tight end, for example. And they're also better at least at using their running backs as receiving weapons. And I think that Singleton's a very good receiver out of the backfield for Penn State. So what I think will happen here potentially is as the game progresses, Penn State is going to make adjustments, and they're going to stack the box even more than maybe they do entering this game. Penn State's defense typically likes to let things settle. They're not very good at defending scripted drives because they just want to see what opponents have, want to adapt, make adjustments, and then move on from there. And all their games this season have shown that. And I'm talking about this matchup a lot because this is the one that matters here. As we'll talk about in a few seconds, if Boise State doesn't score, then Penn State will run them out of the building. But they can score. There is a pathway for them to make this a shootout, and that's how they're going to win, is making it a shootout and breaking tackles for Penn State and utilizing Cam Camper, Madsen's ability to have some rushing yards to make some big plays in open space, give Jeanty a bit of a break there. I also know that Boise State's getting a little bit healthier at running back. They have some backups back that were hurt for this season. So this is the fascinating area here. Just, again, the takeaways that I have are that Jeanty, I think, can make some noise through the ground if his offensive line does a very good job blocking for him. He'll do some things without blocking, but the blocking will help a lot, because if he's having to do everything on himself, he'll maybe make a big play or two, but Penn State's D-line is so good, they'll slow him down just enough to give, the linebackers, safeties, corners time to make sure he isn't popping off a lot of yard runs or getting a ton of rushing touchdowns. But if his O-line blocks for him, and almost on every rushing play he has an opportunity to get to the second level, he could amass over 200 yards in this Penn State defense, because that ultimately, I think, is their weakness, is their backfield play. Their front play is amazing. If you want to beat Penn State and you want to exploit their defense, you try your best to go around their D-line. You'll eventually have to go through it because it's a non-negotiable, and that's why Penn State played Ohio State competitively when they really shouldn't have. It's why they were in it with Oregon at points, because their D-line did just enough to maybe force a stop here and there. But the teams who have beaten Penn State, or who have come close to beating them, have done it in large regards by trying to go around their defensive line and daring Penn State's defensive backfield to make the play to stop the offense. That's the real difference between playing to Penn State and playing to your strengths to beat Penn State. Looking at Boise State's defense versus Penn State's offense, I think you can already see some of the issues that, Boise State will probably have here. And that is, look at tight end, look at quarterback, look at running back, look at wide receiver X, which is where Harrison Wallace and Julian Fleming are, and look at the interior of the offensive line against the interior of Boise State's defensive line. I think that Penn State will be able to run the ball very effectively and also kill Boise State in short passes to Warren. They'll probably be able to hit some explosives over the top to Harrison Wallace III. And I say that because Boise State's defense, look, in terms of scoring, they're not bad. They allow 22.6 points per game, 35th. 0.328 opponent points per play, which is 35th. For Penn State's defense, by the way, they're 5th in both those categories, 15.9 opponent points per game, 0.249 opponent points per play. In terms of scoring offense, Boise State, 37.7 points per game, it's 4th, and they average 0.538 points per play, which is 6th. They're ahead of Penn State in both those areas. Penn State's 17th in points per game, allowing 33.9. They're 12th in points per play, averaging 0.507. But in spite of those numbers from defense, gave the ones from offense to paint the picture better. Boise State's outside the top 80 in opponent yards per pass attempt, allowing 7.6, and also opponent yards per completion, allowing 12.5. 7.5, as College Football with Nerds always says, both Josh and Daniel do wonderful work there. 7.5 is the mark of competency. So on an average basis against Boise State, opponents have a competent game through the air. That's not good. It's not good, especially when we're talking about the Mountain West here. We're not talking about them doing this against the SEC, the Big Ten, the ECC, or the Big 12, all of whom have better QB play. And allowing more than a first down per opponent yards per completion, like well over a first down, and then a few additional yards. And that's not good either. Penn State's numbers there, by the way, are 6.1 opponent yards per pass attempt and 10.4 opponent yards per completion. And Boise State is that regressive in pass defense when they average 3.8 sacks per game and have a sack percentage of 10.81. Or 10.18, rather. 10.18% of their opponents' dropbacks result in a Boise State sack. And they're going up against what is the best O-line they've played all season long. Maybe Oregon in week 2 was better than Penn State is now. Maybe that's so. But I know that Nick Dawkins is better than Charlie Picard at center, who was Oregon's walk-on center who played in that game against Boise State. I know that Oregon's current O-line as it's constructed is better than Oregon's current offensive line in run blocking, especially on the inside. Now, as an overall O-line unit, I don't know, because Oregon has the best tackles in the country. Penn State does not have the best tackles, and their interior O-line is up there. But at this point, we're comparing, what is probably the world's best apple to the world's second best apple in terms of taste. Like they're very close, and someone picking one over the other might just be preference more so than anything else here. Boise State may be able to get pressure on Allar because the tackles have been suspect. Drew Shelton and Nolan Rucci. Nolan Rucci filling in for the sadly injured Anthony Dunco. Be praying for his health. Ahmed Hassanian, and then also Virgin Morgan on the other side, Jaden Virgin Morgan for Boise State. They may be able to get some pressure. And I think that Eric Chenander, with some of the stunts and the all-out speed rush blitzes that he sends, he might be able to make Allar uncomfortable. And that's something that can help Boise State win this game. That's really the only advantage that Boise State may have, though, is at times aspects of their pass rush, because their receivers in the two deep have a lot of questions, but you still have Harrison Walsh III and Tyler Warren. The running backs are really good. Allar has been accurate for much of this year. He's making more high-level throws, better decisions, being more aggressive. And the interior of this O-line for Penn State is phenomenal. So I think Penn State will be able to run pretty easily on Boise State's defense. You look at their grades at strong safety, 67, 71 free safety, 69 nickelback, 79 middle linebacker, 76 weak side linebacker, 69 nose tackle, 58 D tackle, 68 edge, 78 that's Husanian, it's 78 D end, 66 corner, 75 corner as well on the other side. I believe baseline corner and then baseline corner, far side corner. Those are some just new terms that I've recently learned, but good thing that I remember them on my own. For Penn State, their wide receivers, low 60s, maybe high 50s. I still think, though, that, again, you have to adjust these grades a little bit for strength of schedule, a little bit of talent, because they're coming from two totally different leagues with very little cross-referencing. The only cross-reference we have is how these teams both played Oregon, and they both played them close. Boise State played them in week 2. Penn State played this team in week 15, conference championship week. So a large distance between those samples, and I can confidently say Oregon in the Big Ten championship game was better than Oregon in week 2 when they played Boise State, for example. Let's talk about the good, the men, the ugly for both of these teams, and then we'll get on out of here. So very quickly, the good for Penn State, they got a Broyles Award caliber collection of assistant coaches. They have elite depth combined with second half adjustments. They're plus 9.5 in terms of second half margin points per game, which is very impressive. It's especially on defense when they make good second half adjustments. They have a powerful pass rush and run stop from what is an NFL defensive line. They have physical trench play too. They're third in opponent yards per carry allowed in the Big Ten. They're first in yards per carry running the ball in the Big Ten. This is the Big Ten's best rushing offense. And you have to count this fact too. They're first. They're doing this without any alien wide receiver. I don't even know if Harrison Walsh III is an X factor. He might just be a good wide receiver or maybe great wide receiver. I think he could have near elite or maybe even elite potential, but this year he's not consistent enough exactly for that. And regardless of him, there's a lot of depth at that wide receiver room. Part of the reason Ohio State had so much success against Penn State is they dared him to pass. They dared him to pass on him. And because Ohio State has several good secondary players, I would say they have typically 4 of them. One of the corners is good. The other one's typically kind of messing around a little bit too much. But all 3 of the safeties are elite. And their linebackers are too. And a lot of their defensive linemen are near elite to elite players. So you have to have one of the better offenses in the country, and it has to be a balanced offense to move Ohio State's defense. Penn State doesn't really have that. All they have in the passing game is Warren, Singleton, Harrison Walsh III. And in some cases, those players, outside of really Warren, kind of disappear on a game-per-game basis because Drew Allar also has inconsistent play. His upside's awesome, but like I say, in the neutral section, the meh of Penn State, he's inconsistent. You don't know what Drew Allar you're going to get on a game-per-game basis, and that's kind of a meh with Penn State is, yeah, Allar has a lot of upside, but he also has a little bit of a floor that can kind of neuter the passing offense even more. That just makes the trench play more impressive. They run at you, and they run a lot, and opponents know they're going to run, and yet it's so hard to stop. That's how good Penn State's rushing attack is. Tyler Warren has 11 total touchdowns and 1,327 total yards. You got Singleton and Allen, the Thunder and Lightning 2.0. That's what Blake Corum and Hassan Haskins nicknamed themselves, and I think it fits perfectly right here. Allen is kind of like Hassan Haskins was in 2021. And I think that Singleton's a lot like Blake Corum in 2021, where you got the power back, you got the speed guy, and they're one of the better running back duos in the entire nation. We already went over the neutral. We'll get to the ugly here. The ugly is that Harrison Walls III is the only good wide receiver. So as long as you cover him, you're not going to get much production from the receivers of Penn State. They have extremely ineffective special teams. Their punting is very subpar. They don't have a return game. Penn State really doesn't. And they also start slow on both offense, but particularly defense. So slow starts, especially in these big games, often what this does, this relates to why Penn State is so bad for their talent and their win-to-loss ratio in terms of ESPN's game control. They always start games slow. And it's not just slow on one side of the football. It's slow on both. But unlike, let's say, 2022 Michigan or maybe some of the Ohio State teams of the past where they start slow and they just kill you in the second half and it's not close, Penn State sort of slowly crawls their way to victory in a lot of these second half games where they just eke it out, kind of in a clutch way, but not in a dominant way. Exactly. For Boise State, the good is running back Ashton Jeanty, 2,497 passing yards, rushing yards, 29 touchdowns, averages 7.3 yards per carry. The physicality and depth on the O-line and D-line is impressive for Boise State. The pass offense is efficient and yet very underrated at the same time. You look at Maddux Madsen, he has a greater than 7-to-1 TDI&T ratio, and Boise State does not beat themselves. They're first nationally in giveaways per game. They have the least amount of giveaways, where a least amount of turnovers given to opposing defenses in the entire country. They don't beat themselves. For their lack of fundamental soundness at tackling, I think they make up for that in a lot of ways by just not turning over the football and getting enough turnovers on defense to where they win the turnover margin more times than not. Even in their only loss, they won the turnover battle. They had 2 turnovers taken from Oregon, and they gave no turnovers to Oregon. The Broncos are also the healthiest they've been in a while with this long period of rest, so that's something to keep in mind. Neutral for Boise State, the meh. They have not consistently faced a team of Penn State's caliber. So they may get on the field with Penn State, and there's just that shock and awe of, wow, we're facing the best athletes and most physical team we've played all season long. I think this is just neutral because they've played Oregon, so at least they faced something like Penn State. Maybe even, again, maybe Oregon in week 2 was better than Penn State is now, and that will be interesting if that's the case, to how that relates to the result of this game. But it's something to keep in mind. And the pass rush is phenomenal because of volume. It's not because they have a generational D end at any position or D tackle. It's because it's sort of like Ohio State, where there's trade-offs. You can send volume forward because the more people you send, the less people they can block logically, and you'll get more pressure, but there's the risk of allowing big plays. Ohio State does a good job of tactically blitzing and preventing big plays. Boise State doesn't do that. The neutral, of course, is similar to OSU, almost exactly the same, where their D-line on its own doesn't get a whole lot of pressure with just 4 men. Like, they have to send volume to get pressure. The ugly of that, which OSU, the Buckeyes, and many other teams who use this strategy because they have to, that they don't have, is Boise State's totally boom or bust on defense. If they don't get home, it's over. They allow a score. They're outside the top 100 in explosive play rate allowed, and yet, as we've already discussed, they're top 5 in sack percentage. And those things really have a relationship here for Boise State. That's their strategy of defense. We're either going to get to you and get a big play on defense, or we're going to let you have a big play on offense. The offense is also incredibly one-dimensional, relying on GT, and the defense straight up has tackling issues, and that, I think, is part of the epitome of the fact that their roster's limited, of course. So let's talk about 10 reasons why both teams can win. For Penn State, this is their massive, gaping talent advantage. for, bless me, the Nittany Lions as well. This is the fact they have alien players. Number 11, Abdul Carter. Number 44, Tyler Warren. Their second half adjustments are among the best in the country. Elite Big Ten offensive lines, reason number 4. Number 5 are their running backs, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. Number 6 is the NFL caliber defensive line. 7th is their air attack advantage. I think that averaging their O-line, their wide receivers, their tight ends, even how they use their running backs, that Penn State does have an advantage through the air. They have the more balanced offense and defense. Number 8 is quarterback Drew Allar. Number 9 is their bend but don't break defense, which maybe Jeanty gets a lot of rushing yards between the 20s, but once the field condenses, maybe Penn State does a really good job of holding them to some field goals or making Boise State make some tough decisions. And number 10 is James Franklin. I mentioned James Franklin because he's pretty horrific in top 10 games and top 5 games, but a large part of that's due to the talent of the opponents that he plays. And also I think a bit of it now is mental. Like mentally, I don't know if his players and he believe that they can beat Ohio State. Maybe that was the case with Michigan as well to a certain degree, but also Michigan and Ohio State, when Franklin played them, especially from 2021 to 2023 for Michigan in 16 as well, and then for Ohio State basically every year that Franklin has played them, they've been elite teams. Boise State I do not think is an elite team here, nor do they have a talent edge over Penn State. So I think Franklin in a game like this is actually kind of a positive. He does well in the postseason, and Boise State doesn't have a better head coach than he is or a better roster. So I think Franklin here is actually like a legitimate bonus for Penn State in this game. Could be wrong, but just something to keep in mind. For Boise State, number 1 is Ashton Jeanty. Number 2 is their physical run blocking. 3 is their possible pass rush advantage. Number 4 is quarterback Maddux Madsen. 5th is their underrated wide receivers. 6th is their rushing defense, which is solid. 7th is their bend but don't break defense. 8th is the fact that they don't turn over the football much. They're fundamentally sound. They don't beat themselves. 9th is that they've had several weeks to prepare and to rest. And number 10 is that Boise State has already played a top 10 team. So they're more ready for this game than a lot of Group of 5 schools who haven't necessarily had the privilege to play a team of Oregon's caliber, nor to win 12 games to be winners at the level that Boise State is. My potential power rating, my potential power index is really what it's called. Its prediction is Penn State 38.1, a Boise State 21. And potential power believes that these offenses both have matchup edges over each other, that Ashton Jeanty is a non-negotiable, and therefore he is going to move the ball a little bit on Penn State. Also, the fact that Boise State has some good wide receivers, an efficient quarterback, a great offensive line will help their cause against one of the best defenses in the country. They also believe, or my model, not they, but it also believes that Penn State's offense has an even greater edge over Boise State's defense. I think that the model's takeaway is really that Kotelnicki will have a fun Fiesta Bowl. Boise State should be able to be aggressive and their aggression pay off more times than not. Penn State should score a lot of points, but Boise State should also score a lot of points. So I think Kotelnicki will have some fun kind of being the centerpiece of this game here, the centerpiece coordinator. Jeanty should also have fun. I think he'll get yards after contact due to this Penn State defense, some of the issues they've had with tackling. And Penn State's talent and balance at the end of the day is what really makes it a Penn State victory and a 3-score Penn State victory in the eyes of potential power. Let's get to my revised prediction. I didn't really change much of anything. I didn't even change the margin of victory. It's still 21 points. I just think that these teams will score more on each other after watching the film. That's all I changed. Like 45-24, I think Penn State. Wouldn't be shocked if Penn State scores in the 40s, but holds Boise State to maybe a little bit less than 24. Because Jeanty, I think, will get 150 to 200 yards and 2 to 3 rushing touchdowns, but that could be the only scores and offense they get is Jeanty runs. It wouldn't shock me at all if Madsen was held to under 150 passing yards, or maybe even under 100. That wouldn't shock me. It genuinely wouldn't. I do, again, believe, though, that Jeanty will get 150 to 200 yards on the ground, 2 to 3 rushing touchdowns. I think Penn State will slowly adjust, though, and limit Ashton Jeanty. I believe that this game will be high scoring, and at the end of it all, I think the Nittany Lions are just the better team, and that therefore they will win here. I think they're one of the best teams in the country right now. They can win the national championship. Boise State, I don't think they can win the national championship. It'd be an awesome story. I'd root for it, but I don't think it can happen because you need more than just one alien player. They have an alien player, which helps, but Jeanty can't do everything for you. He can't. I mean, the Oregon game's the example of that, where he had an awesome game, and yet they still lost. So I think Penn State wins. I think they win big here, 45-24. I think this is going to be the best rushing offense they play outside of Notre Dame. And while Notre Dame has a better rushing offense than Boise State because they're O-line, so they'll be more consistent, they don't have the same player that Boise State does in Jeanty, even though Jeremiah Love is really good. So this, I think, will be Penn State's most unique test in terms of rushing defense, which is a bit of a relief, honestly. It's awesome if you're Penn State that your defense has so many good players and I think such a non-negotiable D-line that you can say after Jeanty, like, phew, we might play Notre Dame, we might play some of these other schools, but we won't have to face Jeanty again. I mean, Jeanty, it's a testament to how good he is. But again, 45-24, Penn State is my revised prediction for this game. Thank you for watching my deep dive. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Carlo OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being All-Conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I will see you all very soon. Go Broncos, go Nittany Lions, and let us have a fun Fiesta Bowl. Oh, I will be doing play-by-play and commentary for this game tomorrow at the time of this recording at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time when the game kicks off. So, see you all soon. Bye-bye.